Okay, we are going to be in Exodus chapter 12 again this week. Probably this week and next week at least, but we'll see. We're going to be reading today, start out with verse 14 and read through verse 20. Exodus 12. Beginning in verse 14. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the feast of the unleavened bread. For on this very day I brought you your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an alien or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. Did you get that? What kind of bread will we eat? Unleavened bread. Okay, what do we think about that?
I'd say that the penalty for eating leaven was severe. To be cut off from Israel would be to be thrown out, and so he's pretty. I guess since the penalty is so severe, you would think that the reason for the ordinance that he gave him was very important to the Lord.
Okay. It's another way of getting the leavening out of the congregation. The person who eats leavened is removed. So I'm not sure. I should have looked this up. I'm not sure what the process of reconciliation or whatever that would have been on this case would be, how whether this was a permanent expulsion or if they had to go through most sins. You went through a period of purification and atonement and all that, and you got to come back. But I'm not sure about that. I didn't look that up. So if somebody wants to look that up now, that'd be great. Or the one person who's watching online wants to look that up. That would be great. But yes, it's very important. The whole thing, it's a ceremony. It's a ritual. And sometimes we act like those are not all that important, that traditions aren't important, and yet I think they very much are. And this ritual is given great significance. I, through my graduate program, came into contact with a whole bunch of Quakers, and it wasn't that long ago, maybe 100 years or so, that they decided to just completely get rid of all rituals. They wanted no ceremony, no tradition, no ritual observances in their worship gathering. So they didn't take the Lord's Supper. They didn't anything that was a tradition or a ritual. They just got rid of it. Of course, they developed their own traditions shortly thereafter, and one of them is to sit around in a circle and not talk for an hour. And I don't think Church of Christ folks could not. I don't think they anywhere go an hour without talking. But it would be an interesting exercise I think maybe somewhere in the middle might be a good idea. But they have, of course, they didn't baptize then either. They got just anything that was a ritual was seen as a bad thing, and now they're kind of bringing those back in. They have realized that apart from kind of the doctrinal or obedient aspect of keeping these things, there is a need people have for ceremony, for tradition, for ritual, that it is something that serves us well spiritually. And certainly, of course, God is calling Israel to do this, and God has called us to be baptized and to remember Jesus in the Lord's Supper. Yes, sir.
Well, one of the important things about this was that they were not only to keep this ritual, but they were to explain why they were doing it. And so that it would not become a habit or a custom or whatever. It would be new to them every time they did it. And obviously that's what we try to do at the Lord's Supper. We try to remind people why we're doing it, what we're remembering, and so that it doesn't become rote or by habit. It's something we do, and this is why we continue to do it all the time.
I mean, that is I guess the cautioning against taking things like every week, doing it every week, and why a lot of groups maybe don't. They may take the Lord's Supper, but not take it every week, maybe once a month or some other level of frequency. This is an annual observance, but it is for a week at a time. And it's not, in a sense, something that they could just do. They had to prepare for it, getting all of the leavening out of the house. And, really, truly unleavened bread probably gets pretty boring pretty quickly. I mean, this is not about a pleasurable thing to do, because we may think this bread is unleavened. Sometimes we get stuff at the grocery store called matzahs, which is certified kosher, but if it's not said certified for Passover, it's probably got at least a little bit of leavening in it. It probably at least has salt in it, and salt is a leavener. Not a real powerful one, but it does have a leavening, has leavening characteristics. So the real message here is not so much, I don't want you to eat yeast. The message is purify. And in the context of the Exodus, be portable, be ready to go, be ready. If you ladies have baked a lot more bread than I have, that's for sure. I'm telling some of you are expert bread makers, I'm sure. But some breads, you mix the dough all up with the yeast and everything, and then you let it rise, and then you punch it back down, and then you let it rise again, and maybe you punch it down again. I don't know, but you have all this time for the yeast to work on the dough, and it's maybe enhances the flavor and the texture of the bread, but it takes a lot of time for that. You can't do it quickly. And that's one of my favorite things about biscuits. Mom can make a batch of biscuits really quick, especially when you use Bisquick, quick biscuits. But that's the whole message, and it carries over from the Passover, the way they were to eat the Passover meal, which was hurriedly. It's like hitting, in a sense, it's like hitting the drive-through at McDonald's. It's to be done quickly. This is a on-the-go meal, really. And the bread is too unleavened bread. They would mix it up. There's nothing to wait on. There's no reason to let it sit there. You just throw it on the griddle or whatever and cook it very quickly. And I'm sure it had some flavor, but probably not as much as it would have if they put some salt or some other leavening agents in there. But that's not the purpose. This isn't supposed to be a gourmet meal, sumptuous, perfectly seasoned, and paired with the exactly correct wine and mint jelly for your lamb and all that. I mean, it's not supposed to be And I really don't like mint jelly, so that's not a problem. But I love lamb. I like mint, but I don't like mint jelly. But it's the meal, the manner of consuming it, and what they consume both tell the same story, which is a reminder that God brought you up out of Egypt in haste. But when you do things in haste, you still have to prepare. Just as the lamb had to be prepared, had to be selected and held out for 4 days. This bread, you can't just, on the night of the Passover, you can't just have it, make it. You have got to purify and eat it for a while. When we take the Lord's Supper now, again, we usually try to use unleavened bread with it. I think all 4 Gospels, and this is something else you can check. I didn't double check on this, but I think all 4 Gospels just say he took bread and he broke it. It doesn't say unleavened bread. And I read a story one time. The congregation was getting ready to take the Lord's Supper, and the lady who was responsible for it that day had forgotten it was her turn. And in a panic, she ran back into the kitchen there, and the only bread in the building was hot dog buns. So she brought a bunch of hot dog buns out for it. That's all that she had. I'll let you decide whether or not that was acceptable. But it tells the story, but it's also the means of doing it is part of the story. So anybody else have any thoughts on this?
They only did the unleavened bread and the lamb and putting it on the doorpost. That was the first night. The first time they did it, and then they ended up going out of Egypt so fast. Did they stay and have another feast at the end of that 7 days, or did they? That didn't
Well,
happen
the feast starts before the Passover. The Passover is the last day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread.
Okay.
It's the culmination of it.
Was that what happened with them the first time? I mean, did they have that going on for the week before they took it?
Yes, I mean that was the commandment. They observed the full Passover, including the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. The last, they take it once in Egypt, and then the next time they're out, I guess in the wilderness. I'm assuming they kept the Passover in the wilderness.
Did the Jews still do the Passover? Do they do that and put the blood on the doorpost?
I think what you'll see is varying levels of observance from we just have a rack of lamb on Friday night to probably some very strict adherence to this. I've heard that they have a ceremony around the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. I heard a Jewish Christian tell the story one time. It was pretty funny. They take it kind of very seriously, and they go all through the house and take out whatever could be a leavening thing or is leavened or whatever. They get it all. And it's all this house cleaning chore. So traditionally it's by the women doing all the work. And then they will take a pack of yeast and they will open it up and pour it onto a spoon. And then the dad will be given the spoon. The dad walks out of the house ceremonially purifying. He gets all the glory. He gets the credit for all the work the women have done in getting the thing. That doesn't sound like any other cultural thing, does it? When grandma brings the big old turkey out to the table and granddad's going to carve it. Now, he hadn't done anything but watch football all day, but now he's the founder of the feast. And maybe he is. Maybe he paid for it all. I don't know. But it's this ceremony. And again, to what extent they keep it exactly like this. It's, even in Jesus' time, there's some derivation, I guess you could say, from the departure from the strict adherence of it. If we tie everything, and this is one of the problems people have with trying to figure out which day of the week Jesus died and which day of the week he was risen. He observed the Passover feast the last night. Well, if that happens, and he's crucified on Friday, then they observe the Passover feast on Thursday, which is early. Well, we would call Thursday anyway. But he's also renting a room, isn't he? It's not just the family, not just he's got all of his disciples there, and they're not with their families. It doesn't sound like it. It seems like it's just the group of them in that room together. So Jewish worship, including the observance of the Passover, evidently evolved over time. I mean, there's nothing in the Old Testament that authorizes synagogues, but yet they are there, and Jesus teaches in the synagogues. Paul teaches and preaches in the synagogues. And the synagogues fit in nicely with God's intention when they have been scattered, when they're in a diaspora and they're all over the place. They can't always get back to the temple. So they have these little kind of somewhat quasi-temples to go visit, but they didn't think of them as the temple. They knew they weren't the temple. So, there is some evolution to the worship of the Jewish people throughout their experience.
Right. Your question about the unleavened bread, I looked it up in Matthew and it said they were eating the feast of the unleavened
Okay.
bread. So obviously the bread was unleavened.
That's why we use it. Yes. No.
That's when he broke the bread. Why it was during the feast of the unleavened bread. So.
Almost assuredly, it was unleavened bread.
Right. We were sweet.
You wouldn't think they would sneak in some leavened bread during the unleavened bread. Nobody ordered pizza while they were in there.
Yeah. That's probably not unleavened.
So it is. Leaven is generally seen as a bad thing in the Bible. And unleavened bread is not, it's not supposed to be better tasting or anything like that, but it is holier or purer. Deuteronomy 16:3, it is the bread of affliction. So the less desirable nature of unleavened bread is teaching a lesson and reminding them a little bit of the suffering they endured in Egypt. So you don't just remember the escape or the deliverance, you also remember from what you were delivered. And I think that's important. I think a lot of times in our culture today, we like to think of the good times and we don't want to think often of the difficulties. And we don't want to be reminded of our flaws and our shortcomings. And yet Paul constantly brings up his, doesn't he? Paul, when we want to leave things behind and all that, when Paul talks about leaving things behind, he leaves behind his status in Jewish culture is what he leaves behind. Being perfectly positioned in Jewish culture. That's what I'm counting as dung, the King James Version says. Sorry to offend. But, that's refuse, garbage, things you want to disregard and leave behind and never see again. That's what he compared his Jewish heritage to and his very precise upbringing in that heritage. Remembering our own flaws and our shortcomings, remembering what God has delivered us from is a very important component to being grateful and rejoicing in the blessings that we have. And it helps us be content when we have less than maybe we really want. We have a newly made widow in our congregation. It's very sad, but she had a lot longer time with him than she thought she was going to have. And she has expressed great gratitude for that as well. So, the fact that she has lost is tempered by the gain that she had. And one of the reasons she appreciates the gain is she knew what she had before that. So it was worse before he came into her life. It got a whole lot better with him, and it lasted longer than they had a right to expect, I guess. And now it's gone. It's over. But, God blessed them throughout. And So there's hope for the future blessing as well. Again, it's in the New Testament. It's also consistent that leavening is generally seen as a bad thing. In Luke 12, verse 1, Jesus says, "Beware of the leavening of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." And, this concept of leavening, it's not just corruption or impurity. It is the capacity for it to grow and develop over time, to work on a little leavening leavens the whole lump, or whatever. Basically, a little bit of something can have a really big effect. And the kingdom works in both ways. A little seed becomes a big tree. Things grow, things develop, and it can develop good and it can develop bad. And the hypocrisy of the Pharisees is something, again, that Jesus doesn't want to see in his disciples. And yet it's something he thinks is, I think, a real possibility, because these are their spiritual role models. These are the people that they look up to. This is the example they've had of what it looks like to be a religious and devout person. So if they're like that, then that's how I should be. A lot of pro athletes, when they hit their big time and they make their big money, they spend their money very foolishly, don't they? They end up broke a few years after their careers are over, because there was one athlete, when he traveled, he never packed any clothes. He bought new clothes all the time, wherever he went anywhere. Every stitch of clothing he had on was brand new every day. He went broke pretty quick. And there was a guy, you might have remembered him. He played basketball for the Utah Jazz. His name was Karl Malone. And he's a good old northern Louisiana boy. And he grew up in rural, and if you've ever been to northern Louisiana, it's very different than New Orleans. It's very different than southern Louisiana. It's a lot of farms, a very rural, kind of ranchy type environment. So he grew up, and all the rich people he saw were ranchers. And they all had nice pickup trucks and wore cowboy hats and boots and everything. So he gets to go to the NBA, he makes a lot of money. What does he do? Buys a big truck, cowboy hats, boots. That's what he wears. He even buys a big old semi in the off season. Does what Terry does, basically, delivers loads in his semi rig. That's what he does with all his money, because that's what he has seen the rich folks do. So when Jesus cautions against the leavening of the Pharisees, it's not just because they're doing something wrong. It's because there is this potential for his disciples to go and do likewise. And we all are influenced by someone in our life, and usually many someones in our life, as we grow up and mature in the faith. Our parents hopefully had an influence, but not always. And then early teachers and other people we see. We had a preacher when I lived in Central Texas. He was from Mississippi, and they never let him forget that. I've mentioned, and I think Mark's the only one who's ever heard of Jerry Clower. We're going to have to listen to some Jerry Clower sometime. And he was it was like having Jerry Clower be our preacher. And he would make me laugh so much in his sermon. And he would say stuff that was very politically incorrect in Central Texas 40 years ago. So you can imagine how it would go over today. But he would say, but he loved everybody. He had a big heart. He just wasn't as choosy about his examples as he probably should have been. But I would laugh so much at his jokes, and the more politically incorrect they were, the more I'd laugh at them. And Mom would be hitting me during church to get me to shut up. And one time she goes up to him after church and says, "You don't know how much trouble you're getting Ricky into." So he got me in a little bit of trouble, but it was worth it. And I always liked his jokes. But so he had certainly some influence on me growing up. He made preaching look like it would be something fun to do. And he's the only preacher I've ever really listened to that much that made it look fun. I've heard some really good preachers, but he showed you could have fun doing it. And made it fun for everybody else. Even my mom would laugh, but she did. I thought I laughed too much. I think was the problem. I enjoyed those jokes way too much. So I kept laughing after everybody else stopped a lot of the times. We all are influenced by something, and hopefully it's something good that comes into our lives and helps us grow and develops. In Luke chapter 13, verse 21, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to measures of flour that have had some leavening placed in them. And that is a positive use. You don't need you don't cook with just yeast. You put a little bit of yeast in the whole batch of dough. So with that, a small measure of leavening that's added, a big impact flows out of that. And, I think we can look at that. It's easy to get discouraged when you're a small congregation. And in the big scheme of things, the churches of Christ are a very small group overall in the country. That doesn't mean we can't have a big impact. And certainly not over time. If we're faithful, if we don't lose our saltiness, if we are the people God wants us to be, he can do great things with little things. And we may be small, but that doesn't mean we're not powerful because he's working through us. Colossians 4:6, Paul asks his readers to speak graciously as if seasoned with salt. And again, that has a leavening component. And, one of the things that's really changing, and has changed the last 15 or 20 years, is the view of leadership in corporate America and political America and all of that. And there was a time when we kind of looked at leaders and fathers as such authoritarian figures that they just gave you the word and that's it. You don't talk back. You don't question it. And I had a sermon a while back about power difference. You have low power difference and high power difference. And we had high power difference in our culture. You just didn't question the authority. And when you didn't question your dad, you didn't question your football coach, you didn't question your teacher, you didn't question the mayor, you didn't question your congressman, you didn't question your senator, you didn't question the president. You just got in line and did what you were told. That's pretty un-American, though, isn't it, really? We didn't become a country by doing what we were told, did we? They put a minuscule tax on tea, and we went to war. We told the king, we're not going to do what you tell us to do. That's America. That's the America I always thought existed. And so leaders, that's kind of changed. And you cannot lead from an authoritarian perspective, contemporary Americans. You just can't do it. You may think you can, but you can't. To have any chance of doing it at all, you have to have enormous amounts of credibility, enormous amounts of buy-in. And the most effective leadership that's the most common in America today is the cooperative, working together, honoring one another, mutual knowing, mutual learning. They're really having to re-examine how we teach children today. Not just because of what happened in Uvalde yesterday, but because, you used to have to memorize things. Why? Because you can't just look them up. You can't use a calculator on this math test. Why? Because you may not have a calculator one day. Well, guess what? Now you will always be able to look stuff up, and you will always have a calculator with you. You will always have a digital camera recording every stupid thing you ever do, and the rest of the world's going to see it. That's the change in our reality. These are pretty little devices. They leaven the whole lump, don't they? How many lives have been ruined by cell phones? And how many lives have been saved by cell phones? So we're small. A lot of small things don't have a real impressive presentation, but they can be very powerful, especially when used by God. And us speaking, the readers of Paul, who are influenced by his writings, we read, we speak graciously. How many? I'm not going to name any names, but there are still some of these kind of archaic leaders in power in America that do not speak seasoned with salt, do they? And usually what happens is that they don't last in leadership too long because people today will not tolerate that. The culture has changed. We are now low-powered difference. My doctor doesn't know anything. This pilot doesn't know how to fly this plane I'm on. You know, we question all authority. And it's not just the young people, the older people do it too. So we've changed, we've grown. This is where we're at now. And that's still wonderful advice to, keep, remember that what you say as a leader or as a follower, it may not seem like much, but it can have a really powerful impact. Okay, let's look at verses 21 through 28. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin and apply some of that blood to the basin that is in the basin, to the lintel and to the two doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come in to your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which the Lord will give you as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, 'What does this rite mean to you?' you shall say, 'It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the house of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes.' And the people bowed low and worshipped. And the sons of Israel went and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." When we were living in Oklahoma, Dad was back in school working on his PhD at Oklahoma State. And one of his friends, one of his co-students there, was a guy from Thailand. And he and Dad brought Prey Young and his wife over to church one day. And they would come over to our house. And, I didn't really do this very often. I'd go stay with Prey Young and Nanya, just them, by myself sometimes. And I was not the kind of guy the kind of kid that wanted to be away from home at night, but I didn't mind staying with them for some reason. And for one thing, Nanya was a really good cook. So, so was Mom, but so was Nanya. But, and they would just, Prey Young played soccer and we'd go out and hit the soccer ball around and all that stuff. We'd have fun. But he brought Prey Young and Nanya, who were not Christians and are not Christians, I don't think, to this day, but he brought them as a guest to their church, our worship service. And afterwards, whereas a lot of folks who might come to our church service today might say, "Why don't y'all have music?" Which is an opportunity for us to talk to them, isn't it? It's an opportunity for us to say, "Well, we have a cappella singing, and this is why." The thing that stood out to Prey on was the Lord's Supper. And he was wondering what was going on with all that. And that gave Dad a chance to tell the story of Jesus Christ. It didn't have the full effect we would have liked, but it was an opportunity. And when you have children and they come in, and every week we take the Lord's Supper. And like I said, we've talked about this a little bit before, but when we were studying the Lord's Supper. But people say it gets mundane, loses its meaning because we overtake it. Perhaps to them it does, I don't know. But it is this weekly opportunity for us to tell the story of Jesus Christ again. And not just tell it by word, but tell it by deed. tell it in a way that evokes the senses. You touch the bread, you taste the bread, you drink and taste the fruit juice, the grape juice. And I don't know about you, I don't like grape juice very much. So taking that grape juice is always been a little bit of mine. Well, that's a little bit of a sacrifice I'm making here. I don't like grape juice. So some people love grape juice, and more power to you. It's not a sacrifice at all, I guess. But it is a tactile way, and we don't really have a lot of tactile components to our worship service, but it is a tactile way of telling the story of Jesus Christ. I talked Sunday about the cathedral in Spain where they swing the big thing full of burning incense, and that just fills the whole room with that smell of incense. I don't like incense at all. But smell is a very powerful memory component. When you walk into a room that you went to, you've been in a long time, but then you didn't go for a while, and you come back in, and the first thing you do is you smell that familiar smell, the way the carpet smells or whatever. And that really hits it home with the story. Yes, sir.
You talked about the grape juice, and when we partake of it, the Lord's Supper, the emblem, maybe somebody left the juice out too long or whatever, and you'll taste that and you'll think about that. And then I think, I'm thinking about how this tastes this way, or the bread is soggy, or it's too hard, or whatever, all of it, or I get a burnt piece, or, and you stop and realize, what are you remembering? You're remembering the suffering of Christ, and this quote unquote suffering that I'm doing by drinking this grape juice or drinking this burnt piece of cracker. It shouldn't even enter your mind, in comparison to the suffering that we're trying to remember. But we're human, and so it does.
Yes.
But it gives us, I guess it gives us an opportunity to refocus and really look at what's important.
It's the bread of affliction, and it's a remembrance of that this is not the only really good communion bread I've ever had was when I had some of Tammy's homemade communion bread. And I'm not sure that was strictly, I bet that had a little salt in it, and it did, yeah. So it was really good.
Salt in mine.
Well, I'm sure yours is good too. I haven't had yours. But,
You might not like mine.
yeah.
But back then, that's all you had. You had to make it, and it could be burnt or something, because you were doing it by hand. You didn't have the store to buy it.
And you certainly had salt in the house somewhere where you were making it. It's that, and I'm not trying to get us to do all that again, but that's the kind of pulling again from what the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread into our context. The bread isn't really supposed to be absolutely delicious. If it is, I guess that's a bonus. And we're not drinking wine. That's kind of more contemporary and other issues involved with that. I'm not advocating the use of wine at all, but we drink grape juice. And that's still, though, it's the bread of affliction. It is the cup of sorrow. We are sharing with what Christ did and commemorating what Christ did. It is a meal, but it is not sit down and get full on. It's not physical nourishment, physical enjoyment. It is a spiritual meal. And that's the church in Corinth had a problem with delineating between spiritual meal and physical meal. And other churches have had similar problems and have decided to not have any meals in the building as a result. And I can kind of see where they're coming from sometimes. I don't think that's a terrible approach. I don't necessarily think it should be employed. I think it depends on the congregation. But if people when we bring back the potlucks, if everything is about the potluck that Sunday, then we're missing something. We're missing something very important. At the same time, just not eating in the building doesn't mean you're not sitting there thinking about where you're going to go for lunch after church gets out. Because I've done that too, you know. I wonder if they got enough fried chicken on the buffet when I get there, you know, that kind of thing. We can lose sight of the significance of the meal with or without eating in the building together. So I think that's a congregational decision to be made.
One thing we're not supposed to imitate of the Passover meal was doing it in a hurry.
Well, I mean, it was a part of they observed the Passover, and then the Lord's Supper was a part of that. I think it's okay to think of it as we're on a journey. What we are leaving behind and what we're going, not just specifically Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, but what God has brought about through that. So it's we'll talk some more about it. We're over already, so we'll bring back that up next week and talk about it because it is very important. So thank you for your attention and your comments. And Mr. Cole is going to dismiss us in prayer there.
Just a second.